Ava Carter sat on the edge of her small, twin-sized bed, her fingers tracing the lid of a worn-out metal box she kept hidden beneath her mattress. Inside was every hard-earned dollar she had managed to save over the past year. Money collected from late-night waitressing shifts, odd freelance gigs, and every side hustle she could find. It wasn't much, but she was determined to make it grow. Her goal was simple, yet seemed impossibly far away: to free her father. She inhaled deeply, staring at the barely filled box with unwavering determination. Just a little more, just a few more jobs, and I'll have enough to pay for his appeal. Richard Carter had been thrown behind bars when she was just 17. Unlike the innocent men in tragic stories, her father wasn't falsely accused. He had made mistakes. He had gotten involved with the wrong people, and during a police raid, he had been caught with enough illegal substances to ensure a long sentence. But prison had changed him. Over the past few years, he had sent Ava letters filled with remorse, with promises of redemption, and with prayers that one day he could be the father she deserved. And Ava, she wanted to believe in second chances. She wanted to believe that her father could start over. A sudden vibration shook her out of her thoughts. Her phone, cracked at the corners, lit up with an incoming call. She frowned at the name flashing across the screen: James Callahan. Ava and James had been friends for years, though their worlds couldn't have been more different. James came from money, the kind that let people throw extravagant parties for no reason, the kind that made $100 bill feel like loose change. But despite his privileged life, he had always been a bit of a misfit. Someone who preferred sneaking out of high society gatherings to grab street food with Ava instead. "James, what do you want?" she answered, placing the money box back under her bed. "Ava," James's voice came through, breathless and urgent. "I need your help. Like, life or death situation here." She rolled her eyes. "Last time you said that, you just needed someone to fake an emergency so you could escape a family brunch. This is real, I swear." His voice cracked slightly. "It's about Sophie." Ava sighed. Sophie Lancaster, James's secret girlfriend. A sweet but sheltered girl who had the misfortune of being born into a family that saw love as a business transaction. Ava had met her a few times, and she could tell that Sophie was head over heels for James. Unfortunately, Sophie's father, Nathaniel Lancaster, had other plans. Ones that didn't include his daughter running off with a guy beneath their social standing. "Let me guess," Ava said. "Daddy Dearest found out, and now she's locked in some tower waiting to be married off?" "Basically, yes." James's voice was thick with desperation. "They've arranged for her to marry Ethan Montgomery next week. Ava, she doesn't love him. She doesn't even know him. She doesn't even know him. She's being forced into this because of some ridiculous business deal between their families. She's trapped, and I can't get to her." Ava felt a tug of sympathy, but she wasn't sure why James was dragging her into this. "What do you want me to do about it? I'm not exactly a knight in shining armor." "I need you to stop the wedding." She let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, sure. I'll just waltz in, say I object, and they'll all clap and cancel the whole thing." "I'll pay you," James cut in. That made Ava pause. "I know you need money," he continued. "I know you're saving up for your dad. I'll pay you whatever it takes." Ava chewed on her bottom lip, her mind already racing with possibilities. She wasn't an idiot. Crashing a high-profile wedding was dangerous. The Lancasters were powerful. The Montgomerys were even worse. But 30,000, 50,000, maybe even more, that could be life-changing. That could mean freedom. "How exactly do you expect me to stop a wedding, James?" she asked cautiously. There was a beat of silence before he said, "You're smart. You'll figure something out." And deep down, Ava already knew exactly what she was going to do. Ava Carter didn't hesitate once she made up her mind. If James was willing to pay, she was willing to act. She spent the next few days devising a plan, knowing that if she wanted to stop this wedding, she needed something explosive, something that would shake the very foundation of the Lancaster-Montgomery union. And then it hit her. A pregnancy. Nothing ruined a high-society wedding faster than a scandal, and a secret baby on the way was about as scandalous as it got. The key was selling it, making it look so convincing that nobody would dare question her. And if she played her cards right, the entire thing would collapse before Sophie even had to say, "I do." The night before the wedding, Ava prepared her disguise. She couldn't risk anyone recognizing her, especially not Ethan Montgomery. With a short auburn wig, thick, framed glasses, and a sleek, curve-hugging black dress that screamed dangerous woman, she barely looked like herself. She stood in front of the mirror, practicing her best trembling, wide-eyed expression. "You can't marry him, Ethan. You know why. Because I'm pregnant with your baby." She burst out laughing.
It was ridiculous. Insane.
The next morning, she slipped into the church with ease, thanks to the invitation James had provided. The place was breathtaking, dripping in money. Golden chandeliers, a string quartet playing in the background, and guests dressed in designer couture. She kept her head down, sliding into the last pew, watching as the ceremony unfolded. Sophie looked like a prisoner in a wedding gown, stunning but miserable. Meanwhile, Ethan Montgomery stood beside her, tall, dark, and annoyingly handsome. His perfectly tailored suit only added to his air of effortless arrogance. Ava knew his type. Men born with wealth who thought the world belonged to them. The priest cleared his throat, preparing to utter the fateful words. "Do you, Sophie Lancaster, take this man?" Ava shot up from her seat. "I object." Gasps filled the church, heads swiveled in her direction. Sophie's eyes went wide with hope. Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. And then, Nathaniel Lancaster, Sophie's father, rose from his seat, his expression a thunderstorm of rage. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Ava's heart pounded, but she held her ground. She pointed straight at Ethan, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "You know who I am, Ethan." She clutched her stomach, feigning distress. "I didn't want to do this here, but you left me no choice. I thought you loved me, and now you're marrying someone else." The murmurs in the crowd turned into chaos. Ethan stepped away from Sophie, his face a mix of confusion and genuine anger. "What the hell are you talking about? I don't even know you." Tears welled up in Ava's eyes.
She had to sell this.
"How could you say that? You swore you'd take responsibility. That night at the hotel. You promised me we'd figure this out together." The church erupted. Guests whispered behind their hands. Sophie's father turned to the Montgomerys, demanding answers. "This is a lie," Ethan growled, striding toward her. Ava took a step back, her lower lip trembling. "You don't even remember my name. Wow. That's rich, Ethan. But I remember yours. Fernando. Dugan. That's what you called yourself that night, right?" His eyes widened. Just enough. She had him. Ethan turned to his family, his fists clenching. "She's lying."
I swear, she's lying.
But it was too late. Ava felt a victorious thrill as Sophie took advantage of the chaos. With all eyes on Ethan, she slipped away, vanishing into the crowd. Ava knew it was her cue to disappear too. She turned, slipping past the horrified wedding guests, heading straight for the exit. She had done it. Or so she thought. Because just as she reached the heavy church doors, a strong hand clamped around her wrist. Ethan Montgomery's furious voice growled in her ear. "You're not going anywhere." Ava's breath hitched as Ethan's grip tightened around her wrist. His fingers were firm, unrelenting, and when she turned, she was met with his seething gaze. Sharp, calculating, dangerous. "You're not going anywhere," he repeated, his voice low but filled with barely contained rage. Her heart pounded, but she forced a scoff. "Are you serious right now? Let go of me." Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice a whisper meant only for her. "Not until you tell me exactly who the hell you are and why you just crashed my wedding with that ridiculous stunt." Ava swallowed hard. She was so close to getting away. She needed to think fast. She let out a shaky breath and glanced around. The guests were still reeling from her announcement. Sophie was nowhere to be seen. And Ethan's family looked mortified. His mother, whom Ava instantly recognized as the elegant but stone-faced Margaret Montgomery, was whispering furiously to his father, her eyes flickering toward them with suspicion. Ava had two options: keep playing the role of the devastated lover or run like hell. She met Ethan's gaze, narrowing her eyes. "You already know who I am, don't you, Ethan? Or should I say, Fernando?" She twisted her wrist. "Fernando." She twisted her wrist, forcing him to let go. His jaw clenched. "That's not my damn name. And I have never seen you before in my life." Ava smirked, shaking her head in mock disappointment. "Wow, you're really gonna pretend, huh? I should have expected that from a man like you." She sniffled dramatically. "But you know what? It doesn't magically. But doesn't matter. I'll take care of the baby myself." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh, stepping closer. "You're insane." She lifted her chin defiantly. "It is for me." And with that, she turned sharply on her heels and walked away. Fast, but not fast enough to look like she was running. Every step felt like a battle to keep her heart from slamming out of her chest. She needed to get out of there now. She had done what she came to do. The wedding was ruined. Sophie was free. She'd collect her money, disappear, and never have to see Ethan Montgomery again. Or so she thought. Because just as she reached the church steps, two large men in suits blocked her path. Bodyguards. Ava barely had time to react before she felt Ethan right behind her. His voice was calm, too calm. "Take her to the car." "Excuse me," she snapped, whirling around. "I'm not going anywhere with you, you entitled." But one of the men already had his hand on her arm. "Shh." Ava tried to jerk away, but it was useless. They were too strong, and before she knew it, she was being dragged toward a sleek black car parked near the curb. She struggled, but Ethan's voice cut through her panic. "Unless you want the police involved, I suggest you cooperate." Ava froze. Her mind raced. If the police got involved, they'd start asking questions. Questions that would lead back to Sophie, to James, to everything. She couldn't risk that. She sucked in a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Fine. Get in the car, Ava." She stiffened. He knew her name. She turned, eyes flashing. "How do you?" "I did my homework." Ethan opened the car door, his gaze never leaving hers. "Now get in." Ava hesitated. She considered making a break for it, but the bodyguard were too close, and Ethan was watching her like a hawk. With a quiet curse, she climbed into the car. The door shut beside her, trapping her in a luxurious interior that smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Ethan slid in beside her, and the car pulled away from the church. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Ava folded her arms.
So what? Now? You gotta interrogate me? Torture me? Or maybe throw me off a bridge?
Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. Jesus, you're dramatic. He turned his head, staring at her. You just ruined my wedding. You lied about being pregnant with my child. You embarrassed my entire family. And now you're sitting here acting like you're the victim. Ava rolled her eyes. Oh, cry me a river, Montgomery. You'll survive. His expression darkened. That remains to be seen. Ava swallowed. For the first time, she started to wonder if she had seriously underestimated Ethan Montgomery. Ava sat stiffly in the back of the sleek black car, her mind racing as Ethan watched her in eerie silence. The streetlights outside flickered across his sharp features, making him look even more intimidating than he already was. The weight of his stare was unbearable, but she refused to show weakness. Instead, she crossed her arms and huffed. So, are you going to tell me where we're going, or is this some kind of kidnapping? She snapped, her voice dripping with defiance. Ethan exhaled sharply, tilting his head as he studied her. You're awfully bold for someone caught in a lie. Ava scoffed, shifting in her seat. You still haven't proven that I lied. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was colder, more calculating. A chill ran down Ava's spine, but she kept her expression neutral. She had handled worse situations before. She had faced rejection, poverty, and people who wanted nothing more than to see her fail. Ethan Montgomery was just another rich jerk who thought he could control the world. The car slowed, then turned sharply onto a long gated driveway. Ava's stomach clenched as she saw the grand estate looming ahead. It was massive, too massive, with towering pillars, expensive cars neatly lined up outside, and more security guards than she cared to count. The Montgomery estate. Panic flared in her chest. He's taking me to his family home? Let me out, she said, reaching for the door handle. Ethan chuckled darkly. It's locked. She turned to glare at him. You're seriously keeping me hostage. You're here until I get some answers. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it. One that made Ava realize he wasn't playing around. The car pulled to a stop, and within seconds, the door was opened by a guard. Ethan stepped out first, then gestured for her to follow. She hesitated. Ava. His voice was quieter this time, but it carried an unmistakable warning. Grinding her teeth, she stepped out, her heels clicking against the pristine pavement. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and freshly cut grass. Inside, the mansion was just as extravagant as she imagined. High ceilings, marble floors, chandeliers that looked like they cost more than her entire existence. Ethan led her through the grand hallway, past a few maids who stole curious glances in her direction. She could feel their judgment, their unspoken questions. Who is she? Why is she here? Finally, they reached a private study. Ethan pushed the door open and motioned for her to enter. Ava hesitated, but the sound of the heavy door clicking shut behind her made her realize she had no choice. He walked to the bar in the corner, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He didn't offer her one. Let's cut to the chase, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Tell me exactly why you did it. Ava crossed her arms. I already told you. Don't lie to me, Ava. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. I know you're friends with Sophie. I know she hired you to ruin the wedding. What I don't know is why you agreed. She flinched. He had done his research. Ava exhaled slowly, considering her options. Lying further would only make things worse. I needed the money. She met his gaze head on. That's it. No hidden agenda, no personal vendetta against you. Your fiancé didn't want to marry you, and I saw an opportunity to make some cash. Simple. Ethan stared at her for a long moment before taking a slow sip of his whiskey. 30 grand, he murmured. Ava blinked. What? That's how much Sophie paid you, right? 30 grand? Her throat went dry. He knew. He set his glass down and leaned against the desk. Tell me, Ava, was it worth it? She hesitated. Because now, he continued, his voice silky smooth, you're in my debt. Ava's stomach twisted. She could handle angry grooms and rich families, but this was something else entirely. What do you want? She whispered, dreading the answer. Ethan smirked, pushing off the desk and stepping closer until he was only inches away. You claim to be pregnant with my child. His voice was low, lethal. So now, Ava, I'm going to make sure it's true. Ava's blood ran cold at Ethan's words. She tried to step back, but his presence was overwhelming, his piercing gaze locking her in place. You're insane, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Ethan tilted his head, watching her with a calculated look. Am I? He asked, his tone eerily calm. Or are you just realizing that you made a very costly mistake? Ava forced herself to breathe. Look, I did what I had to do. I was paid to stop the wedding, that's it. I never actually claimed to be pregnant. It was just a lie, one that worked, obviously. So if you're looking for revenge, you're wasting your time. Ethan took another step toward her, making her back hit the edge of the desk. His presence was suffocating, his scent, a mix of expensive cologne and whiskey, filling her lungs, wasting my time, he repeated, his lips twitching in amusement. Ava, I don't waste my time. Unlike you, I don't do things without purpose. She swallowed hard. Then, what do you want from me? He smirked. Oh, I think you already know. Ava's stomach twisted with unease. She was used to navigating tough situations, but this was something else entirely. Ethan wasn't just angry. I'm not actually pregnant, she stated firmly. Ethan nodded. I know. She blinked. You? What? I had you examined while you were unconscious, he admitted shamelessly, watching for her reaction. Ava's breath hitched, her fists clenching. You had no right. I had every right, he cut in smoothly. You humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. You cost me my business deal, my inheritance, everything I spent years working for. And now everyone in my family, in my social circle, believes I have a pregnant mistress running around. Ava glared at him.
Well, that's not my problem.
Ethan chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Oh, but it is. Because now you're going to fix it. Ava's stomach twisted with dread. What do you mean, fix it? He leaned in, placing both hands on the desk, effectively caging her between his arms. You're going to become exactly what you pretended to be, Ava. Pregnant. Ava's pulse pounded in her ears, her entire body tensing at his words. That's ridiculous, she stammered. You can't just... I can, he said, his voice unwavering. She tried to shove past him, but he caught her wrist effortlessly, his grip firm but not painful. Let me go, Ethan. This is insane. No, What's insane is thinking you could interfere in my life and walk away without consequences." His voice was eerily calm, his thumb brushing against her pulse. "You played a dangerous game, Ava. Now you're going to live with the results." Her breathing grew ragged as she shook her head. "No, no way, you can't force me to—" "You have two choices," Ethan interrupted, his grip tightening just slightly. "You leave here with nothing, and I make sure you never find work again. I'll ruin your life so completely that you'll wish you had never stepped foot into that church." Ava clenched her jaw, refusing to show how much his words rattled her. "Or," Ethan continued, "you do what I say. You agree to carry my child, and in return I'll make sure you and your precious little life stay intact. Hell, I might even compensate you generously." Ava's stomach turned. "You're out of your mind." "Am I?" He raised a brow. "Think about it, Ava. You're broke. You have no one to help you. Your options are limited. But if you go along with this, you'll have everything you could ever need." She hated that part of her brain actually considered his words, even for a second. She was broke. She was broke. She'd been living paycheck to paycheck, scraping by with odd jobs just to survive. And now, thanks to him, she had even fewer opportunities. But agreeing to this, to him— "And if I refuse?" she challenged, lifting her chin. Ethan's smirk widened. "Then you can walk out that door, Ava. But I promise you, once you do, you'll never recover from what happens next." The weight of his words settled in the pit of her stomach. She was trapped. And Ethan Montgomery knew it. Ava sat in stunned silence, her mind racing in every direction as Ethan's ultimatum settled over her like a suffocating weight. He had backed her into a corner, and no matter which way she turned, she saw no way out. Her entire life had been about survival, about clawing her way out of impossible situations. But this was a game she had never played before. "You can't seriously expect me to agree to this," she said, her voice barely steady. Ethan simply leaned back in his chair, watching her with an infuriating calm. "I don't expect you to agree," he mused, tilting his head slightly. "I expect you to realize you don't have a choice." Ava's hands clenched into fists.
You
"No, but I do own your future," he replied smoothly. "Unless, of course, you'd rather test just how powerful I really am." Her heart pounded in her chest, frustration and helplessness mixing into something bitter on her tongue. She had always been the one in control, even when life threw her curveballs. But Ethan Montgomery had rewritten the rules of the game before she even knew she was playing. A long silence stretched between them before she exhaled sharply, her eyes narrowing. "And what happens if I agree?" she asked through gritted teeth. "You think I'm just going to go along with whatever you say, like some obedient little pawn in your twisted plan?" Ethan smirked, his eyes dark with amusement. "Oh, Ava, I have no illusions about you being obedient. But I do expect you to uphold your end of the bargain. You'll carry my child, you'll marry me. And in return, you'll have financial security beyond your wildest dreams." A hollow laugh escaped her lips. "Marry you? Are you joking?" He shrugged. "Not at all. My family expects a proper image, and a single pregnant woman just won't do. You're going to be my wife, Ava." Her stomach twisted. "And after?" She pressed. "What happens when the baby is born? You get what you want. And then what? You throw me away." His expression didn't shift, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. "That depends," he murmured, "on whether or not you prove useful beyond this arrangement." The cold calculation in his tone sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't thinking of her as a person. She was nothing more than a means to an end. Ava straightened her back, meeting his gaze with a defiant glare. Ethan's brows lifted slightly. More, "You want me to carry your child? Marry you? Then I have terms too," she said, forcing strength into her voice, even as she felt her pulse race. "I want a contract, in writing. When this is over, I get a settlement large enough that I never have to work again. And I want my freedom, no strings attached." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. Surprise, maybe even a hint of admiration. "You're negotiating," he mused. "I may be trapped," she admitted, "but I'm not stupid." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Fine," he agreed. "I'll have my lawyers draft the contract. But let me make one thing clear. Ava," his voice dropped, turning dangerously soft. "The moment you sign, you're mine. No running. No backing out. You belong to me until this deal is done." Ava swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where would she go? She had no power, no leverage, no way to fight him on this. And, worst of all, she knew he was right. She had no choice. 2 days later, Ava sat in Ethan's massive office, staring at the thick stack of legal papers in front of her. Every line, every clause, every carefully crafted sentence spelled out her fate. Marriage, pregnancy, a year of her life tied to a man who had turned it upside down. "This is your last chance to walk away," Ethan said from across the desk, though there was no real concern in his voice. He knew she wouldn't walk away. Ava gritted her teeth, grabbed a pen, and signed her name. Ethan smirked, his fingers tapping against the desk as he watched her. "Good girl," he murmured, his satisfaction unmistakable. Ava dropped the pen and met his gaze with a glare. "Don't ever call me that again." Ethan only laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, Ava," he said, amusement lacing his voice. "This is going to be fun." Ava stood in front of the massive, ornate doors of the Montgomery estate, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The sheer size of the mansion made her feel insignificant, like she was walking into the lion's den with no armor, no weapons, just the weight of the contract she had signed binding her to Ethan. She clenched her fists, pushing down the gnawing sense of unease creeping up her spine. She was here now. There was no turning back. The door swung open before she could knock, revealing an older woman in a pristine uniform. "Miss Sinclair," the woman greeted coolly. "Mr. Montgomery is expecting you." Ava nodded, forcing herself to step inside. The grand entryway was overwhelming. High ceilings, chandeliers dripping with crystal, the scent of fresh-cut roses lingering in the air. Every inch of the place screamed wealth, but instead of admiration, all Ava felt was suffocation. "Right this way." The woman led her through the long halls, the sound of Ava's heels clicking against the marble floors, making her feel like an intruder. She was ushered into a lavish sitting room where Ethan sat, legs crossed, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look up immediately, instead, taking his time as if she weren't even worth acknowledging. When he finally did, his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers, scanning her like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're late," he said simply. Ava lifted her chin. "Traffic." Ethan smirked, setting his drink down on the sleek glass table beside him. "I hope you're ready," he said, standing and walking toward her. "My mother is eager to meet you." Her stomach clenched. "Your mother?" "She's hosting a dinner tonight," he said, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. "She insisted you be present." Ava exhaled slowly. This was happening too fast. She had barely settled into the reality of living under the same roof as Ethan, and now she had to play the role of his fiancée in front of his family. Before she could protest, a new voice cut through the air. Well, is this her? A woman entered the room with the kind of presence that commanded attention. Tall, poised, and dressed in an elegant black gown, she carried herself with the effortless grace of someone born into power. Ethan turned toward her. Ava, meet my mother, Eleanor Montgomery. Ava had barely opened her mouth when Eleanor's piercing gaze landed on her, scanning her from head to toe with the kind of scrutiny that made Ava's skin prickle. She's interesting, Eleanor finally said, her tone unreadable. Ava bit back a sharp reply, instead forcing a tight smile. Nice to meet you. Eleanor's lips twitched as if amused. We'll see about that. She turned to Ethan. I expect both of you to be on time for dinner. No excuses. With that, she swept out of the room, her presence lingering like a storm cloud. Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding.
Charming woman.
Ethan smirked.
She'll be worse if you embarrass me tonight?
Ava glared at him. I'm not here to be your puppet, Ethan. No, he agreed, stepping closer. You're here because you made a deal. And I suggest you start playing the part convincingly. My family doesn't tolerate weakness. Ava's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. I don't do weak. Ethan studied her for a moment before nodding. Good. Later that evening, Ava stood in front of a gilded mirror, smoothing down the silk fabric of the dress Ethan had sent to her room. It fit perfectly, too perfectly. The way it hugged her body made it clear it had been tailored just for her. She wanted to hate it, but she couldn't deny it made her feel powerful. With one last breath to steady herself, she stepped out of her room, finding Ethan waiting for her in the hallway. He took one look at her and smirked. You clean up nicely. Ava rolled her eyes.
Let's get this over with.
They walked side by side into the grand dining hall, where Eleanor and a few other family members were already seated. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Ava. So, Eleanor said, picking up her glass of wine.
Tell us, Ava, how did you and Ethan fall in love?
Ava's throat went dry. Ethan, ever the composed one, reached for her hand under the table, squeezing it just enough to remind her of the role she had to play. Ava forced a smile. It's a long story. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes sharp. We have time. Ava glanced at Ethan, whose smirk deepened. He was enjoying this. Bastard. Ava sat in the grand dining hall, her fingers tightening around the silver fork in her hand. Across from her, Eleanor Montgomery observed her like a hawk, her piercing gaze stripping away every layer of composure Ava had managed to build. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, but she refused to be the first to crack. Ethan, seated beside her, exuded an effortless calm, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his wine glass. It was infuriating how relaxed he seemed when she was sitting in the middle of a battlefield. So, Ava, Eleanor finally spoke, setting down her glass of wine. Tell us, what are your intentions with my son? Ava blinked. My intentions. Eleanor's lips curled into something resembling a smile, but there was no warmth in it. Yes. What exactly do you hope to gain from this engagement? Ava forced herself to remain composed, despite the way Eleanor's words coiled around her like a snake, squeezing the air from her lungs. I don't expect to gain anything, Mrs. Montgomery, she said smoothly. Ethan and I are together because we want to be. Eleanor arched a perfectly shaped brow. Is that so? She turned to Ethan. And you expect me to believe you suddenly fell in love with a woman no one in this family has ever heard of? Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, taking a deliberate sip of his whiskey. Believe what you want, Mother, but Ava and I are engaged. That's all that matters. Eleanor hummed, unimpressed. Forgive me if I find that hard to accept. It's just unusual, don't you think? She tilted her head, eyes gleaming with curiosity. A woman from nowhere suddenly appears and claims the heart of my son? Ava clenched her jaw, willing herself not to react. She should have expected this. Women like Eleanor Montgomery didn't accept outsiders easily. I don't care if you accept it or not, Ethan said, his voice sharp. Ava is staying. She's part of this family now. A long silence stretched between them before Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. Well, if that's the case, then I suppose we should get to know each other better. Shouldn't we, Ava? Ava's stomach tightened at the veiled challenge in her voice. Of course, she said, lifting her glass of water. I'd love nothing more. The rest of dinner passed in a tense blur. Eleanor continued throwing subtle jabs at her, asking about her background, her education, her upbringing. Each question meant to poke holes in her story. Ava answered every one of them with the grace of someone used to fighting battles she wasn't meant to win. By the time dessert was served, Ava was exhausted. She wanted to leave, to crawl into bed and pretend this entire dinner never happened. But as soon as they left the dining hall, Ethan grabbed her wrist, pulling her into a secluded hallway. What the hell was that? She hissed, yanking her hand free. Ethan smirked, amusement flickering in his eyes.
What?
Your mother was testing me. You just sat there and let her do it. I wanted to see how you'd handle yourself, he admitted. And I have to say, I'm impressed you didn't break. Ava let out a frustrated breath, crossing her arms. Glad to know I passed your little test. Ethan's smirk didn't fade. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low murmur. Welcome to the Montgomery family, sweetheart. This was only the beginning. Ava wanted to slap that smug look right off his face. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, ignoring the way her heart pounded just a little too hard. She had survived tonight, but she knew one thing for certain: Eleanor Montgomery wasn't done with her yet. Ava paced the length of her bedroom, her thoughts tangled in frustration. She should have expected this. The Montgomerys were powerful, ruthless, and they never let anyone into their world without a fight. Eleanor had made it painfully clear that she considered Ava an intruder, someone unworthy of standing beside Ethan. And Ethan, damn him, seemed to be enjoying every second of watching her struggle. She stopped in front of the massive window, staring out at the sprawling Montgomery estate. It was a kingdom, one she was expected to navigate with nothing but sheer will. The deal she had struck with Ethan was beginning to feel more dangerous than she had anticipated. Just as she was lost in thought, the door creaked open behind her. She turned sharply, heart pounding. But it was just Ethan, leaning against the doorframe with his usual smirk. Could you at least knock? She snapped. He lifted a brow.
My house. My rules.
She crossed her arms. What do you want? Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His smirk faded into something unreadable. How are you holding up? Ava scoffed. You mean after your mother practically tore me apart at dinner? Oh, I'm fantastic. I love being treated like a charity case. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. She's testing you. Yeah, no kidding. She'll come around, he said, sounding almost apologetic. Ava narrowed her eyes. You don't actually believe that? No, Ethan admitted. But I do believe you can handle her. Ava hated how his confidence in her sent a thrill through her chest. She wasn't doing this for him. She had her own reasons for agreeing to this arrangement, and she couldn't let herself be swayed by the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. She turned away, staring out the window again. I just need to survive this long enough to get what I came for. Ethan moved closer, his presence warm against her back. And what exactly did you come for, Ava? She didn't answer. She couldn't. She faced him, her expression guarded. Why do you even care? For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something real, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But just as quickly, the mask returned, and he smirked. I don't, just making sure my fake fiancé doesn't crack under pressure. Ava wanted to shove him, but instead, she rolled her eyes. You're insufferable. And yet, you're still here. Before she could snap back, a knock interrupted them. The door opened slightly, and a maid peeked inside hesitantly. Mr. Ethan, Miss Ava, Mrs. Montgomery has requested your presence in the study. Ava's stomach tightened. Another test. She could feel it. Ethan's smirk didn't waver. Looks like round 2 starts now. Ava exhaled sharply, straightening her shoulders. She wouldn't let Eleanor intimidate her. Not now, not ever. When they arrived at the study, Eleanor was seated behind an antique desk, a glass of whiskey in her hand. She gestured to the 2 chairs across from her. Sit. Ethan strolled in, casual as ever, but Ava kept her guard up as she took a seat. Eleanor sipped her drink, then set it down carefully. Let's not waste time. I don't believe in sugarcoating things, Ava. I don't trust you. Ava met her gaze head on. I figured. Eleanor's lips twitched. At least you're not pretending to be naive. She leaned forward, steepling her fingers. If you think being engaged to my son means you've won something, you're mistaken. The Montgomery name is not freely given. You will prove your worth, or I will personally see to it that you regret stepping into our world. Ava's pulse pounded, but she didn't look away. She had fought her way through worse than this. She lifted her chin. Then I guess I'll just have to prove you wrong. Eleanor studied her for a long moment before a slow, calculating smile crossed her lips. We'll see. Ava stood in front of the Grand Montgomery estate, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had never been one to fear a challenge, but something about this moment, the weight of the expectations, the way Eleanor's words still lingered in her mind, made her stomach churn. She wasn't sure if she was walking into a test or a trap, but either way, she had no choice but to face it head on. The door swung open before she could knock, revealing Ethan, dressed in a sharp black suit, his expression unreadable. You're late, he murmured, stepping aside to let her in. Ava rolled her eyes. I wasn't aware this was a timed event. He smirked. Everything in this house is a test. You should know that by now. She ignored him, stepping past him into the sprawling hallway. The entire house exuded wealth and power, but she had no time to be intimidated. She was here to prove herself, to Eleanor, to Ethan, and to herself. As they made their way to the dining room, she stole a glance at Ethan. He looked composed, as if none of this fazed him. But she knew better. She had seen the way his jaw tightened when his mother spoke, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes when he looked at Ava, as if he was trying to figure her out just as much as she was trying to figure out her place in his world. The doors to the dining room were already open, revealing a long table set with silver and crystal. Eleanor sat at the head, her gaze cool and assessing. To her left was an older man Ava recognized as Ethan's uncle, Marcus Montgomery, a man known for his ruthlessness in business. Across from him sat a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Ethan, his sister Victoria. Ava had yet to interact with her, but from what she had heard, Victoria was just as formidable as Eleanor. "Ah, Ava," Eleanor said smoothly, lifting her glass of wine. "So good of you to finally join us." Ava forced a polite smile. "Thank you for having me." Ethan pulled out a chair for her, and she sat, keeping her posture straight despite the nerves twisting in her gut. Dinner began, and for a while, it was almost normal. Conversations about business, investments, and the latest social scandals. Ava listened, careful not to say too much, knowing that anything she revealed could be used against her later. But she should have known Eleanor wouldn't let her off that easily. "So, Ava," Eleanor said, setting down her fork, "tell me, how does it feel to be engaged to my son? Surely this must be quite the upgrade from your previous life." Ava clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. She wouldn't let Eleanor get under her skin. Not tonight. She met Eleanor's gaze directly. "I wouldn't call it an upgrade," she said smoothly. Ethan smirked at that while Victoria raised a brow, intrigued. Eleanor, however, wasn't so easily amused. A challenge indeed. "And tell me, Ava, what exactly do you bring to this family? Aside from your—" Ava's fingers tightened around her fork, but before she could respond, Ethan spoke. "She's resourceful, intelligent, and doesn't back down," he said casually, as if he wasn't throwing her a lifeline. "You should appreciate that, Mother." Eleanor's lips curled into something resembling a smile. "Is that so? Well, I suppose we'll see." The rest of dinner passed with thinly veiled jabs and silent battles of will. But Ava held her own. By the time the meal was over, she felt drained but victorious. She hadn't cracked. As she and Ethan stepped out onto the estate's vast balcony, she exhaled, finally allowing herself a moment to breathe. "You did well," Ethan said, leaning against the railing. Ava shot him a look. "I don't need your approval." He chuckled. "I never said you did." She crossed her arms, staring out at the night sky. "Your family is exhausting." He smirked. "You have no idea." Ava glanced at him, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just fighting for survival in this world. She was starting to want to win. Ava woke up in a luxurious bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin. The early morning sunlight streamed through the floor, to ceiling windows casting golden hues across the massive room. She blinked groggily, the weight of exhaustion still clinging to her. It had been a long night, filled with tense glances, whispered arguments, and an overwhelming realization that her life was no longer her own. She turned her head slightly, her gaze landing on Ethan, who was sitting at the edge of the bed, already dressed in his crisp white shirt, the top button undone. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the strong lines of his forearms, and he was staring at his phone, deep in thought. Ava shifted, and that tiny movement was enough to make him glance at her. "You're awake," he said, his voice still husky from the morning. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, barely. Ethan set his phone down and studied her for a moment. "We need to talk." Ava's stomach tightened. She knew that tone. It was the same one he had used the night before when he had pulled her aside after the dinner with his family. "About what?" she asked cautiously. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "My mother's making moves. She's already set up a public announcement about our engagement. By the end of today, the whole city will know." Ava felt her breath hitch. She didn't even ask us first. "She doesn't need to," he said, his voice calm, but there was a sharp edge underneath it. "She controls the narrative, and we have to play along." Ava's fingers clenched the sheets. She had agreed to this arrangement, but that didn't mean she had come to terms with it. "So what does that mean for me?" Ethan stood, walking to the window. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a sign of his frustration. "It means we have to make this look real. No more avoiding public events. No more pretending this is just a business deal. We have to sell this. Ava." She swallowed hard. The idea of pretending to be the perfect fiancé under the watchful eyes of the media and high society was suffocating. But what choice did she have? "Fine," she said, forcing her voice to steady. "I'll do what's necessary." Ethan turned to her, his sharp gaze softening just slightly. "I know this isn't what you wanted." Ava let out a dry laugh. Understatement of the year. He sighed, stepping closer. "I'll be right there with you." She looked up at him, searching for any trace of dishonesty. Instead, she found something else. An understanding that neither of them had asked for this, but they were stuck in it together. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Ethan strode over and pulled it open, revealing a sharply dressed assistant holding a sleek tablet. "Mr. Montgomery," the assistant said, "the press conference is set for noon. Your mother expects you both to be there." Ethan didn't react, but Ava could sense the shift in his posture, controlled irritation. He took the tablet and glanced at the information. "Tell her we'll be there." The assistant nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Ethan closed the door, his expression unreadable. "Looks like we don't have much time." Ava slid out of bed, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Then let's get this over with." Ethan watched her for a moment longer before nodding. "Get dressed. We leave in an hour." As she stood in front of the mirror, pulling on the designer dress that had been chosen for her, Ava couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment she lost herself completely. But then she caught Ethan's reflection behind her, adjusting his cufflinks, his face unreadable but his presence steady. No, she thought. This wasn't the moment she lost herself. This was the moment she learned how to fight. The day of the wedding arrived faster than Ava had anticipated. The Grand Montgomery estate was adorned with thousands of white roses, shimmering chandeliers, and an air of prestige that only the wealthiest could afford. Guests had already begun to arrive, their chatter filling the massive hallways, their eyes searching for glimpses of the bride and groom. Ava stood in front of a gilded mirror in a private dressing room, her reflection barely recognizable. The ivory silk of her wedding gown clung to her figure in all the right ways, the delicate lace wrapping around her arms like vines. Like vines. A long, flowing veil cascaded down her back, making her look like the picture-perfect bride. But inside, a storm raged. She smoothed her hands over the fabric, inhaling deeply. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a contract, a finalization of everything that had led her here. A business deal disguised as love. A soft knock at the door made her spin around. The door cracked open, and her father stepped in. His once worn face looked almost young again, beaming with pride. "You look breathtaking," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ava swallowed the lump in her throat. "Dad." He stepped closer, his gaze filled with an emotion she hadn't seen in a long time. I know this wasn't the fairy tale you imagined, but I want you to know, no matter what happens, I am so proud of you." Ava blinked back tears. I don't know what's real anymore." Her father took her hands. "Then make it real, sweetheart. Love isn't always about how it begins. Sometimes, it's about what you choose to build." Before she could respond, another knock came. This time, it was Ethan's mother. "Ava, darling," she said smoothly, stepping in. "It's time." Ava's heart pounded. This was it. The ceremony was nothing short of a spectacle. Hundreds of guests watched as Ava glided down the aisle, her arm linked with her father's. Ethan stood at the altar, looking more composed than ever, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable when he saw her. As she reached him, he extended his hand. Ava hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was warm, steady, safe. The vows were exchanged, the ring slipped on her fingers, and then came the moment that sealed everything. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant announced. Ava barely had time to react before Ethan pulled her closer, his lips pressing against hers with a slow, deliberate tenderness that sent a shiver through her. It wasn't just a show for the cameras or a performance for the guests. There was something real in the way his fingers tightened around hers, in the way his lips lingered just a second too long. When they pulled apart, the applause erupted, but all Ava could hear was the rapid beat of her heart. The reception was an extravagant affair. Champagne flowing, music playing, guests mingling. Ava smiled when expected, laughed on cue, played the perfect role, but her mind was elsewhere. Later in the evening, as she stepped onto the balcony for a moment of fresh air, she felt Ethan's presence behind her before he even spoke. "You're quiet," he noted, standing beside her. She exhaled, gripping the balcony railing. "I guess Ethan was silent for a moment. Then he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We figure it out. Together?" Ava met his gaze. "And if I want more than just a deal..." His lips curved into the faintest of smirks. "Then we rewrite the terms." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Is this how all your business negotiations work?" Ethan took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers. "Only the ones that matter." Ava held his gaze, her heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a deal anymore. Maybe, against all odds, this was the beginning of something real. Lesson learned from Ava and Ethan's story. Life doesn't always go as planned. Ava never expected to find herself in a contract marriage. Just like Ethan, never imagined he'd be forced into a situation that demanded a business over love. But life has a way of surprising us. This story teaches us that love isn't always about how it starts. It's about what we choose to build. Relationships, like businesses, require trust, compromise, and effort. At first, Ava and Ethan's relationship was based on convenience. But as they spent time together, they realized that genuine love isn't about grand gestures or perfect beginnings. It's about choosing each other every single day. Another powerful lesson is that sometimes the unexpected moments in life lead us to exactly where we need to be. Ava walked into this arrangement thinking she was sacrificing her happiness, but in the end, she found something far more valuable than just security. She found a partner who respected her, challenged her, and ultimately loved her. Most importantly, this story reminds us that we are not defined by our circumstances. Ava could have remained trapped in resentment, and Ethan could have seen their marriage as nothing more than an obligation. Instead, they embraced change, took risks, and chose to write their own love story. What about you? Have you ever experienced an unexpected turn in life that led you somewhere better? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, let me know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story filled with drama, love, and life lessons. See you in the next one.